Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. In this video we are looking at 10 Regency authors who are not Jane Austen. So without further ado, let's get stuck in, shall we? In case you don't already know, at the beginning of February, there is going to be a readathon going through the whole month called Febregency, where we focus on Regency period writings. And this is headed by Emma from Bookish Princess. Also co-hosting will be Christy from Dostoevsky in Space, Jennifer from Jennifer Brooks. So go and look at their channels and subscribe, and I'll be hosting along with them. But here's the thing, I know a lot of you want to read more from the Regency period. That's the turn of the 18th to 19th century, the height of the Romantic period. But the only name most people can think of at that time is Jane Austen. She is sort of the name over all of the Regency, at least from our perspective. So I want to give you 10 different authors who you can go to really get an insight into the works of literature people were reading and enjoying at that time. It's very insightful. I will say 2 of them are technically not in the Regency period, they're just before, but the 2 books I'm going to mention have a dramatic effect on the books of the Regency. They're referenced constantly by other Regency authors. So here goes for our 10 Regency authors who are not Jane Austen. First up is the giant of the Regency period. We think of Jane Austen. Although she sold books in her day, she became much more popular later on. The author who dominates the Regency period at the time is Sir Walter Scott. So Ivanhoe and Waverley and Rob Roy, they're the books that are most commonly known. So Rob Roy follows the story of Francis Osbaldiston. He falls out with his father, Sir Osbaldiston, and he's sort of banished, sent north to be with his cousins in Northumberland. This is the county of England next to Scotland. Now, while he's there, they're not a particularly nice group, but he finds out that his cousin, Rashleigh, I love that name, not Ashley, but Rashleigh, he is in support of sort of the Jacobites in Scotland wanting to replace the king. And he is trying to undermine the family and bring their downfall. And so Frank as he's called in Airs Francis, has to go north and sort of seek the help of Rob Roy MacGregor, proper Scottish name, to come and sort things out. It's got the classic stuff of, you know, action and threat and romances, as in falling in love and trying to separate the bad guy from the good girl, all those kind of things. Walter Scott was the just beloved writer of romances. People absolutely adored him and his poetry. So if you want to get a flavour of what people actually loved in the Regency, what the characters in Jane Austen would have read in their daily lives, take a look at Sir Walter Scott. And actually, Waverley or Rob Roy would be a good place to start because there was a particular fascination about Scotland in that day. So that was number 1, Walter Scott. Our second writer from the Regency period, and I'm going to look at a book that is from the 1790s, I think it's 1796, is Maria Edgeworth. Again, a huge figure in Regency novels. When I say Regency, I mean in the Regency period. So the most famous of Maria Edgeworth, and she wrote a number of novels, is Castle Rackrent. Maria Edgeworth is what you would call an economic writer, somewhat political. So she has things to say about the economy and running of the country at the time, particularly estates, and she's a bit critical of that. So with Castle Rackrent, she follows the Rackrents, which the actual castle is called Rackrent, and you get the Rackrent family. She follows them through 4 generations of different landlords, and they all are served by a steward called Thady Quirk, and he tells the story. Now, the thing about Quirk, he's a very self-serving steward and he sort of manipulates the landlords. And what Maria Edgeworth is getting at is how badly a lot of holdings are run throughout the country. How the estates should really be reformed in the way they're running. And amongst the owners, you've got, the drunk, the classic drunk that dissipates. You've also got someone who is quite mean and absolutely horrible. You've got a gambler in there. You've got someone who's generous but very improvident as well. And all the way through, Quirk is manipulating events so that he can build up an amount of fortune for his son, Jason Quirk. And the story is a satire. It's very much a satire where these characters are sort of turned into humours. If you've been part of the new Patreon site, we've just had a discussion about what humours are in literature, and here you will see 4 classic humours occupying the stage. So that's the book we're talking about next, and the authoress we're talking about next, which is Maria Edgeworth, and if you want to start somewhere, Castle Rackrent. Next up is someone who is equally popular, perhaps even bigger than Maria Edgeworth, and that is Anne Radcliffe, the great high priestess of the Gothic novel, which of course was beginning to abound at this time period. She was the forerunner, probably a greater influence than Horace Walpole, who wrote The Castle of Otranto. So you've got books like The Romance of the Forest, which you may have read, The Mysteries of Udolpho, which is mentioned in Northanger Abbey as one of the horrid books of Gothic literature, which is being satirised by Jane Austen. But both of those come just before the Regency. They're in 93 and 94, I think, 1793, 94. 1796 sees The Italian, which I've talked about before, and this has got every single trope of Gothic literature in it. It's the star-crossed lovers who try to escape, and there's gloomy houses and abandoned places, and there's monasteries and suspicious goings on, things that go bump in the night, and in the background manipulating it all is the malevolent monk Scudoni, Father Scudoni, trying to work for his patron to break up the lovers. And there's kidnap involved and very dangerous moments. So that's your classic Gothic story, isn't it? And I don't want to give anything away, that's why I'm talking generally. So that's the next Regency author. Again, if you really want to know what was being read around that time, Anne Radcliffe is pretty much a must to read. So there you go, Anne Radcliffe. Speaking of Anne Radcliffe, that brings us to our next authoress, who only wrote 2 novels, the famous one being A Simple Story, and her name is Elizabeth Inchbald. Now, the story I want to focus on is actually Art and Nature, which she wrote within the Regency period. The Simple Story came just before, like a fraction before. But before we do, Elizabeth Inchbald, what an interesting character. She was born I think she had 9 siblings or 8 siblings. And she had a speech impediment, a stammer. But she wanted to work as an actress, and so worked really hard to become an actress until her father put a stop to it. He wouldn't let her get a position in the theatre. But she was determined, so she went to London and became an actress at 18, and there was sort of mixed opinions apparently about having someone who's still got a little bit of a stammer, though she's working on it. But what she did do by being an actress is she became capable as a playwright. And then she meets Anne Radcliffe, the great novelist, who encourages her to write a novel. And she does A Simple Story, which becomes a bestseller. It outsells a lot of Radcliffe's works. So that was good for her. And then she writes her second novel, Art and Nature, which is a satire and apparently is quite a forceful and not too subtle cudgel against society. The story follows William and Henry. They're 2 lads whose father, who's a shopkeeper in the country, dies. And he didn't leave them anything. In fact, they escape his debts because he died. And so they head off to London to try and make a living because they have no financial stability. Now, the younger one, Henry, he can play the fiddle. And using that, he starts getting work and then getting patronage and begins to be quite popular and gets supported by the elite and mixes in higher society. Henry can't get financially stable, and so William tries to help him with his education in university. Now, William's the eldest, so when he qualifies university, there's this dynamic in play about power. Shouldn't the oldest be in a higher position? And, what's more important, academia or an artist playing the fiddle? And there's a whole play on power, education and position, which Inchbald is taking a look at through this satirical novel called Art and Nature. So there's your next authoress, and that is Elizabeth Inchbald, protege of Anne Radcliffe. Now, a significant writer, like very popular writer, at the latter end of the Regency and then the early Victorian period is Sir Bulwer Lytton, who wrote some great romps of stories. People really thoroughly enjoyed them, and he mingled with some pretty high-class writers himself. Now, his first book was written during the Regency period, and that was Paul Clifford. And it's your typical romance. Paul Clifford is actually a gentleman who also works as a highwayman. And this is set during the time of the French Revolution, when footpads and highwaymen were quite a bit of a problem at the latter end of the 18th century. So the audience were very fascinated by this period. In fact, Bulwer Lytton gives us our predominant story about Dick Turpin as the highwayman, the gentleman highwayman. Now, what happens is Paul Clifford, he is playing a confidence trick one night, dressed up as a highwayman, and he meets Lucy Brandon. And she's beautiful, so he falls in love with her, because this is the romantic period. You only have to look at someone and you're in love. But the problem is, he's eventually caught as a highwayman and taken before the judge, who is Lucy Brandon's uncle. And then there's a big plot twist, which I won't tell you. Upshot is, he's sentenced, and now what's going to happen? What's going to happen to the two lovers? Is he going to die? All that kind of stuff, and the drama of it all, the melodrama, which is typical of high romance. And, a good rip-roaring read, which the public loved. And particularly, again, Jane Austen's period in the drawing rooms. These are the kind of escapist novels of adventure that people wanted to read. And one thing about Paul Clifford, the novel, is it has one of the most famous incipits in literature. An incipit is like the opening line or opening two lines of a book. Once upon a time is an incipit. Paul Clifford starts with, "It was a dark and stormy night." So that was our next author, Sir Bulwer Lytton, Paul Clifford being his first novel. Our next authoress is someone who is going to excite you if you've never read her before or even heard of her, because she caused an absolute uproar in society. She was the most hotly debated and talked about writer of that Regency time period, and it was someone called Lady Sydney Morgan. Lady Sydney Morgan, she has an extraordinary sort of active life. She's Irish. And so she has a feeling towards the Irish culture, heritage and people, because they were sorely oppressed during the 18th century particularly, and on into the 19th for a long time, by the English, who really treated the Irish in a very bad way. She went abroad and she did travelogues, which, some wanted to censor. She actually wrote books which Percy Shelley, the poet, really admired and based some of his works later on her. So this person, she is very, very influential. And her most famous work, novel, is The Wild Irish Girl. Sounds a good title, doesn't it? And this is set in Connacht, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the old kingdom of Connacht. Now, you've got to remember, in English history, you had Oliver Cromwell invaded Ireland, took over it, and the English went tearing through, sort of replacing the nobility of Ireland with English aristocrats. So in the story of The Wild Irish Girl, half of it is epistolary, which is sort of the theme for our Febregency coming up. So half of the book is written as letters from the main protagonist, Horatio M., to an MP in Ireland. And he talks about how he's found this run-down castle, which happens to contain the remnants of an ancient noble Catholic Irish family. And he spends time there, but because he doesn't want to let them know that his ancestors have replaced them, kicked them off, he acts as if he's this sort of unemployed artist, and so he stays with them and he starts forming, friendships with them, especially with Glorvina, the girl there, the beautiful girl, and they start to fall in love. But of course his father has other ideas. His father wants him to marry into high society. There is also an unknown suitor for Glorvina's hand. But what Sydney Morgan does through this book, apparently, is she starts making an argument for the greatness of Irish culture, preserving it, respecting its history. She does that by putting footnotes in as if it were an editor adding things, so that she can seed the story with Irish culture. And of course the protagonist himself is going to sort of be swayed and come to respect Irish culture as well. So this was quite a remarkable story of its time. Glorvina, the main heroine of the book, she comes to epitomise sort of Ireland embodied. So much so that Lady Sydney Morgan was sometimes referred later on as Glorvina, because she so powerfully represented the country of Ireland and its culture and history. So that was the next authoress. Have you ever heard of her? Lady Sydney Morgan. I think you'll also find her called Sydney Owenson as well. Our next writer from the early Regency period is the authoress Regina Maria Roche. Now, I can't quite remember how many books she wrote. I've never read any of them. I think it was 3. But apparently her first one, The Children of the Abbey, was tremendously successful. So successful that it remained in print for the entire 19th century. So if you write a book that lasts for 100 years, you've done a pretty good job. And the story is a classic Gothic with all the classic tropes. You've got the big house. By the way, if you've not seen it, please go and watch my video on the 8 aspects of Gothic literature. It will help you understand Gothic literature much better. All the tropes that are in that video are in this book, and you've got Amanda and Osborne Fitzalan, I think it's called. I think that's their names. They're 2 siblings who are denied their inheritance by some kind of old forged will. So that's a classic Gothic idea as well, something to do with inheritance, documents which are sort of dark and shady. And you've got the haunted abbeys, or the supposedly haunted abbeys, and it's called The Children of the Abbey. Now, this book is mentioned by Jane Austen in the book Emma. It's also mentioned in Emily Climbs by Alan Montgomery. And if you like Georgia Eyre, this book is mentioned in the book Arabella by Georgia Eyre. What I find particularly funny about this book is that a Unitarian minister in America, Samuel Crothers, he said that this book spawned a regiment of Amandas amongst the Americans because it was such a popular book that parents were naming their daughters Amanda because of Amanda Fitzalan, the heroine of this book. So there you go, that was our next authoress. It was Regina Maria Roche. The next writer on this list is Jane West, and I put her in this list because she is a different angle of novel that you might want to read to get a more rounded flavour of what people were reading. It's not all romance, it's not all Gothic, it's not all satire. There's a lot of moralising literature as well. Don't let that put you off, by the way. And Jane West was also, she was a proponent of this sort of moral educational literature, which was very conservative in its values. Her actual pseudonym, her pen name, was Prudentia Homespun, which I think is a fabulous name. I don't think it would sell many books now, but evidently it worked back then. Now, 2 of her books, A Tale of the Times and The Infidel Father, again, they're making quite a severe case for a certain way of behaving. So in A Tale of Times, what she takes aim at primarily is she's sort of anti-Jacobin. So actually we've mentioned the Jacobins already in Walter Scott with Rob Roy. The Jacobins, they're sympathetic towards the quite far left form of socialism, overthrowing of monarchy, a bringing of republic everywhere, the liberation of the lowly, and the destroying of the first estate kind of thing. So pretty hardcore revolutionaries. Well, those sentiments were quite strong in England, and that worried a lot of people. And of course, they'd seen the barbarous nature of what the French Revolution turned into with its Madame Guillotine. And so in A Tale of the Times, Jane West, or Prudentia Homespun, she decides to tell a tale which is anti that ethos. And then her next book, The Infidel Father, I think talks about atheism, which was a growing trend, although quiet, a growing intellectual movement. And so she takes the conservative approach towards that. She also writes tracts and pamphlets if you're interested in something non-fiction of the time. So there's our next author, Jane West. Now the next two books that I want to mention were both written before the Regency period, but were extraordinarily popular in the Regency period. So would have affected other writers and were definitely in the libraries of anyone with a library. The first of them is Oliver Goldsmith's The Vicar of Wakefield. This book is referenced all over the place. George Eliot references it. Stendhal, the great French author, references it. Dickens references it. Louisa May Alcott references it. I could probably carry on. Charlotte Bronte, she references it. You know, this was a very influential book that everyone who read. The book itself is very pastoral, you know, it's a bit of a country idyll, the idyllic setting with the vicar of Wakefield. He is Dr. Charles Primrose, and he's doing rather well financially. He has a lovely family, sons and daughters, George being the eldest son, and he does so well in his investments that he gives his £35 a year wage to widows of other clergy members to look after them. Now his son George is meant to marry, is it Arabella Wilmot, if I remember her name correctly, and she's the daughter of a rather wealthy merchant chap. But just before the marriage, the vicar, Charles Primrose, goes bankrupt. And Arabella's father, being a very prudential fellow, he decides that the wedding has to stop. And so we have a change of the life of the family. They have to go and live in a different place. They've got a dodgy landlord over them, and there's rumours about all this, that and the other. Now, it's a sentimental novel in that it focuses on, the good, innate good in human beings. So it's got that. But also, what's funny about that, which is typical of the 18th century satire, is Charles Primrose, the vicar, is constantly banging his head against the fact that the world is extremely sinful and he doesn't seem to fit in it. So there's it's a sentimental novel which also seems to take the mick out of the sentimental novel. So that's the next book, The Vicar of Wakefield by Oliver Goldsmith. If you want to get into Regency period, even just the history, read that book, because it would have been read by a lot of people. And just one aside about Oliver Goldsmith, apparently he was quite a short bloke, 5'4". He was impetuous and disorganised, so much so that apparently he intended one day to go to America and start up a new life there, but he didn't go because he missed the boat. So he's the kind of person I would love to have met. But there you go. Oliver Goldsmith, The Vicar of Wakefield. That's a book you should read if you're interested in the Regency period. And the final author on our list, or more specifically, it's for a book that I bring this up, again written just before the Regency period, is Laurence Sterne's The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy. This is another book that's just seen quoted everywhere by some of the great writers of the 19th century and the Regency period. Tristram Shandy is such a funny book, because Tristram Shandy is trying to describe his own life. But he never knows where to begin. It's interesting that he should talk about that, because it's quite revealing about literature itself, that an author, Laurence Sterne, recognises that where is a beginning? Where do you actually start? Because wherever you decide to begin, there's always something that led up to that. And the joke about Tristram Shandy is he's trying to tell an autobiography, really. He's trying to explain his life and the things he's learned. But he hardly ever gets round to telling you anything about himself because he's forever trying to work out how to put himself across and going off on these extraneous details and following some hilarious bumbling characters and nagging characters, and just it's just like a great array of 18th century figures with Tristram Shandy hilariously trying to describe everything to you. When he tries to start, he ends up having to go back to the moment of his conception, and he reckons that he had one of the problems with his being, his character, is because at the very moment of conception, his mother decided to ask his father whether he had wound the clock up in the hallway, so she wasn't concentrating, and he inherited that as a fetus, and that made him undeveloped. So it's things like that. It's just these quirky things that he begins to talk about. However, this was super popular as a book and highly influential on other writers, particularly in the mode of satire. So if you want a background in the Regency mentality and things that underpin it and what people were reading, you really should read Laurence Sterne's The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy and Oliver Goldsmith's The Vicar of Wakefield. I hope that you have enjoyed this list. I certainly enjoyed putting it together. There's some authors on here who I've never read, and I intend to really go out and enjoy their works. But I thought I'd put this together so that you can join us on the Febregency Readathon, and this will give you an idea of different books to write. That, by the way, is why all of the authors here are British, because the Regency is British. It's about when the prince was a regent, ruled on behalf of his mad father, King George. So King George was still alive as a king, but his son reigned in his stead, and that's called a prince regent. That's why they're all British. So yes, which one do you like the sound of, and which of these authors have you never read before? Leave a comment down below, and if you know anyone that loves that time period, they read Bridgerton and they read Jane Austen, send them this video. Share it on your Facebook somewhere or on your Instagram, please. It does no end of good for me with the algorithm. And if you hit the like button and subscribe, I will see you in our next video. Until then, I wish you joy in your reading.